Thank you very much for the opportunity to testify today. And I'm going to go back to the Pacific Branch Library, this lovely library. One of the things that sort of is interesting, and a number of things that was in my testimony issues were raised earlier, but one of the things that's interesting about going to these sessions is that you hear, at least in my case, from the Brooklyn Public Library, the latest iteration of their spin on what they're going to be doing for us. And I think there were two things that were really interesting today. One was that they're really not talking anymore about the Pacific Public Library. If you listen to Linda Johnson, she's talking about the BAM South Library. And I want to be real clear. The BAM South Library is not located in the community served by the Pacific Branch Library. Those are two different communities. And to say that what's going to happen at the BAM South Library is going to serve the existing community is ridiculous. The other thing that I'd just like to talk a little bit about, because we really haven't gotten too much into the Pacific Library Branch, is to remind people that it was opened almost 100 years ago. It was the first Carnegie Library in Brooklyn, and it was the first New York City library planned with children in mind. The designer was a very noted architect of the time, Francis Amaral, who has a number of landmark buildings in New York City and outside of the state. And it actually is one of the few distinctive buildings left on the upzoned 4th Avenue corridor. In both November 2004 and March 2013, the Park Slope Civic Council, of which I am a trustee, submitted requests for landmark evaluation of the Pacific Branch building to the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Unfortunately, despite the obvious landmark worthiness of the building, those requests have gone unanswered. But function is just as important as architecture when you're talking about the value of a community library. And the public use of the Pacific Branch has increased close to 60% over the past 10 years. In 2011, the last year for which public data is available, the circulation was over 93,000 annually. However, the functional community value of the library goes beyond circulation. In the last quarter of 2012 alone, that's just 3 months, the Pacific Branch hosted 62 community meetings in its meeting room, attended by over 1,100 people. It hosted an additional 320 adults, attended 85 sessions on such topics as computer basics, resume writing, crocheting, and knitting, and 11 programs such as after-school homework help, Jumpstart, Read for the Record, and Toddler Time, aimed at children and young adults, brought another 2,000 visits to the library. Living 6 blocks away from the Pacific Branch Library, I can personally attest to deep community attachment to both the building and the community function of the library. The library continues to serve the low and moderate income populations for which Carnegie libraries were originally created, providing a wide range of programs. Library users come from PS 38, as Assemblywoman Millman mentioned, from the Brooklyn High School for the Arts, and from Middle School 447, where both the PTA president and the principal have publicly expressed support for preserving the library. Residents of Gowanus and Wyckoff houses, 2 public housing units on the south side of Flatbush, are also Pacific Library users. Those of us who live near the Pacific Branch Library experience it as critical to our sense of place in a neighborhood where undistinguished development run rampant has left little trace of the architectural and historic character of the community. what has been talked about earlier was the fact that the Brooklyn Public Library says, it's just a couple blocks away, but it is in fact in the BAM South location is in fact in a very different neighborhood and crosses one of the most difficult intersections in Brooklyn. And while the original downtown plan, the downtown Brooklyn plan, envisioned a library at the BAM South site, like they're apparently going to have, it was never intended as a replacement library for the Pacific Branch. The original intent was to build a culturally focused library, which could be fine. That intent, however, was echoed at recent BAM South hearings when the president of BAM, Karen Hopkins, enthused about locating 150 years of BAM history in the proposed library. That's really putting a lot of pressure on what's supposed to be a community library. An influx of people occupying the new high-rises in the downtown Brooklyn area perhaps suggests the value of new library resources on the north side of Flatbush. However, it emphatically does not suggest stripping resources from the community on the south side of Flatbush to accommodate expansion of a cultural district and upscale rental units. Local community support for preserving the Pacific Library is strong. You've heard from a number of our elected officials today, and one of the things that's very curious is that really virtually all of our elected officials at the City Council, the state, and the Assembly level had been very clear in talking to the Brooklyn Public Library and saying, we're against your plan. The library function should stay where it is. The building should be preserved. Yet the library claims that it wants to continue dialogue. The Civic Council, of which I'm a member, has facilitated discussions about the Pacific Branch, has created an action website, www.savethepacificlibrary.org, easy to remember, has created buttons and posters focused on saving the Pacific Library Branch, and has solicited supporting resolutions from local elected officials and other community organizations. Two of our council people who you heard from today, as well as Joan Millman, have written to the Landmarks Preservation Commission in support of our landmark request. The Borum Hill Association has joined our efforts. The Prospect Heights Neighborhood Democratic Council, the Prospect Heights Neighborhood Development Council has formally endorsed our position. The Independent Neighborhood Democrats recently passed a resolution supporting both preservation of the Pacific Branch and the Brooklyn Heights Branch. As noted in Branches of Opportunity, which is the new favorite thing to sort of quote when you're talking about libraries, I mean, one of the things that is pretty striking, or actually confounding, has been the Brooklyn Public Library's continual ineptitude in fundraising for the library, especially in terms, as you pointed out, Joan, of lobbying both the city and the state for permanent funding streams that would avoid this crazy annual library dance. Nor have they been very effective in soliciting public contributions for the library. According to their audited statements in 2012, their contribution level was about $3.2 million, which has been pretty consistent for the last couple of years. There was a higher level right before Linda Johnson came in, and then it dropped. I'm not going to attribute that to her, but whatever. They raised in 2012. They raised $382,000 from special events, but they spent $1,003,000 on fundraising. The net on their efforts doesn't seem to be all that terrific. Again, as reporting from the Center for Urban Future, the Brooklyn and Queens libraries have failed to make use of friends of, and then insert your neighborhood branch name, organizations to garner financial support for local libraries. The report also noted that major nonprofits like universities, hospitals, and cultural organizations have long expected that their board members help fundraise in the communities. With help from the city officials who appoint library board members, and that's sort of 11-11 with between the borough president and the mayor, the process for the libraries in Brooklyn and Queens could do the same. There's no reason that the Board of Trustees should not be held to a standard in terms of assisting with fundraising. Such approaches are far superior to the one-time sale of precious assets to make up for shortfalls in planning. As we have learned the hard way in New York City, once such public assets are gone, they are gone forever, along with their character, their community cohering effects, and their value. Thanks again for the opportunity to talk on this topic.
Thank you, Ms. Avery. I think if we've learned one thing today, it's that the Pacific Library needs to be landmarked.
And if you send a note,
I'd be happy to join with my colleague, Ms. Millman, in doing just that.
that would be terrific. Thanks so much.
Before you step away, I have to tell you what the response we got from Landmarks was in our request
Right.
for landmarking, which we sent fairly recently, was, we're really sorry, but we don't have the time during this session of our existence to do a thorough review. But certainly BPL has time to sell off our libraries.
Right. And they did a thorough review of the library 10 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Avery.